Welcome to today's episode of the Cross Labs podcast, On My Mind.
Let's talk about, websites. You have generative models, and that means that certain kind of content can be really amplified. So you can make it appear as if there's 100,000 times more people saying one thing than are actually saying it. So now let's say you are trying to come up with evidence to make some kind of decision or to understand a situation, and you're surveying what you think to be independent evidence of that. But someone has the ability to really mess with the ratios of the evidence without actually changing the uniqueness of the evidence, let's say. If you're in a world where the amounts of evidence can be easily manipulated by people, and you still want to do inference and try to figure out like what's true or what you should do, the question is there like a better inference algorithm than a standard Bayesian inference that would be robust against people manipulating the amounts of evidence you see without manipulating the content of that evidence?
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. So it's like a math, because I know like some people were, especially post 2015 and 2016, after Cambridge Analytica scandal came out and stuff like that. A lot of people were investing in companies that would take conglomerates of news sources and contextualize them a little better. So you can see, you can look up a topic and then see all of the different perspectives on that topic with some maybe extra context or something. But the idea was to give a more rounded perspective to try to combat misinformation. But it's not like a mathematical thing. It's more like hey, let's engineer a solution based on the technology that we have. But yeah, I think that's still an outstanding mathematical question of, maybe not mathematical, but like theoretical, right? Like in theory, is something like that possible, and what are the limits on that?
So it went to a kind of disturbing place. One way to construct this would be to say, I'm not only just going to model the world, I'm going to model the potential adversary. So I'm going to be a bit paranoid and say, what if this news source is biased? And what are my mental models of what their bias possibly could be? And I'm going to then like factor that into the probability of like, what am I not seeing? And then you can do the entire thing in a Bayesian way. It's like a meta Bayesian thing where now you're inferring not just the thing that's being reported on, but also stuff about who's doing the reporting. And at least in the kind of simple toy system that I was working with, this had the side effects of this, although it's like formally it makes sense to do this. First of all, it didn't save the agent in making decisions that were based on expectation values. That is to say, if you have your whole probability distribution over what's possible, the agent would be less fooled and they wouldn't give as high of a belief to the specific thing that the adversary might be trying to get them to believe. They would instead like converge to a broader distribution where they might give some belief to that, but some belief to the true value and some belief to something totally unrelated and so on. But the average of the thing was just as susceptible to being manipulated as when you don't model the adversary. So if you were making a decision based on, I'm an agent, I'm going to use Bayesian inference to make a decision between two financial choices based on the expected cost to me. If the adversary can manipulate the statistics of that variable, having this extra like paranoia agent aspect to it does not save you at all. You'll still have your choice be manipulated exactly as much. This is all, the example system is just like a biased coin and someone hiding some of the coin flips from you. So it's a very low dimensional system. In a high dimensional system, it may be easier to get independent evidence of like whether or not there's a bias in the source of the data rather than the actual system that produces the data. But in the low dimensional system, it's very easy to hide one behind the other. The other thing that happened that was kind of surprising is that the more you believe that it's possible that the data source is being manipulated, the more likely it is that you put strong beliefs into extreme things that disagree with what you observe. So like, let's say it's actually a fair coin, so it's a 50-50 chance of heads, and you believe that someone might be hiding the result from you whenever it's heads or whenever it's tails, according to their own preferences, with some, quite high probability. Then it's not necessarily that you actively believe that someone is doing it, but you believe that someone could be doing it, right? So you consider the hypothesis that someone might be very strongly manipulating the coin. You then start to have a concentration of belief on like very extreme values of the bias. Instead of just having this kind of like broad, flatter thing around 0.5, you'll have like a spike at 0.8 and a spike at 0.2. So you start to find the extremes of the distribution more likely. And that's because when the adversary can kind of hide their intervention along the same axis as the variable that you're measuring, your prior basically does not get updated. Like there's a curve, this kind of equivalent curve of hypotheses that all give you the same stochastic process, and your prior along that curve doesn't get updated. If you have a lot of like prior belief in the possibility that there's a strong adversary acting on your data feed, it will concentrate in a way that makes you more susceptible to thinking that the truth is much more extreme than it really is. Which, sounds worrying, like certain things that we may observe in people. It sounds a little bit worryingly related to polarization and extremism. So, that's fun. I'm hoping that in the high dimensional case, there are more tricks that you can use to kind of like not have this special curve where an adversary can just perfectly hide their intervention in a way that just helps people confirm their prior paranoia.
It kind of actually makes sense, because if I try to make it into like real life terms, it is easier to fall into the crazy rabbit hole once you think something is controlled.
Yeah, I mean, maybe another example would be if I believe that literally everything online is just the output of some language model that's been asked to generate charged content, I'm more likely to believe that, the reality in the world is even more crazy than maybe it actually is, based on the few things that actually leak through that don't seem very crazy, because I'll just assume that even those things that don't look very crazy were probably just produced by someone manipulating me. And if they're manipulating me, why wouldn't they manipulate me as strongly as they possibly could? So the real world must be very different than what I'm actually seeing. Then I trap myself basically into having a strong prior belief in the kind of conspiracy theory. Setting myself into a way of thinking that makes it impossible to disprove, I think, is the issue. Like it's a bit of a stretch to go, because I think the real situation of that is not just Bayesian inference and rational, whatever reasoning, but it's more of an actual like human mental position that's more emotive and more than just that.
It sounds like the easier way to not like get into one of these situations would be to just assume that every toencast is a fair toencast, even if it is being manipulated.
Yeah, so that prevents you from having the concentration to the extreme results, but that can also mean that if you are being manipulated, you have a very high confidence in something false. So it's a trade-off. That's the thing about it that's nasty, is that there is actually a trade-off. And if the system is simple enough that the adversary can perfectly hide their, what they do in the natural statistics of the system, and I have yet to figure out how hard that becomes in high dimension. So that's the escape route for this. If it turns out that in high dimension it's much harder to hide your interventions than it is to discover them, then it's fine. You just need a very nuanced view of things. You can't look at a single question and look at the news or look at stuff online or evidence aimed at just deciding a single question. You have to actually like simultaneously try to decide many things at once. And then the kind of manipulative behaviors would hopefully have a different pattern of evidence than the natural behaviors that a natural system or the natural line of events could actually produce. Yeah, that's, to be determined, I guess, is how dimension affects it, and like what happens when you actually have an adversary who is, even with these simple experiments, I'm assuming a model for the adversary in order to do this inference. And if the adversary is complicated, they don't necessarily have to follow a simple model, so they could like manipulate things one way and then turn around and manipulate things another way. And what would really be great would be to derive some sort of universal robustness where it's like, oh, you just have to do inference this way, then you can guarantee that an adversary cannot manipulate your beliefs by more than this much, and the only thing you pay is convergence speed. But in low dimension, I don't think that is going to be possible. In high dimension, it may still be possible, and then that would be pretty good.
Okay, and now let's assume we live in a scenario where there is multiple news sources, let's call it, right?
Yeah.
One is biased to side A, one is biased by side B, and like the third one is not biased at all. If we live in a world where the audience has a bunch of priors on, oh, I'm being manipulated to this way or being manipulated to that way, as in a very high polarized place, then basically the news source in the middle is the one who's not gonna get viewers, right?
I don't think it necessarily is as simple as that. In the case that you have multiple news sources, if you model it as saying each of these sources is a different censor who is filtering the same raw truth but with a different filter, then with enough independent news sources, you should actually be able to figure out their biases. and then you should be able to correct for their biases. And so that you essentially, rather than like saying, I'm only going to listen to this news source and not the others, you specifically say, like, whenever I hear this news source say this, I will use the statistical model of like how often in the past they've understated or overstated things and adjust what they're saying according to that model of how likely it is that they have tweaked the numbers or left something out. And so there would be certain patterns, like if I see these 5 news outlets say this and these other 5 say that, and they overlap on these 3 things, then putting all that information together, I would be able to get more accurate information about the truth than if I only picked like, this is the one I trust the most, and I'm only going to read this one. That's if they're independent, then you can in principle do that.
Wouldn't it be an actual good use case for an LLM? Don't roll your eyes yet. If you have like statistical analysis of the news that 20 news sites do, right? And then you say, okay, in the invasion of country A against country B, these 5 websites were this % off in the statistics they were giving. They were hiding these numbers about these events and so on. So then at the end, you can have an inference saying like, dude, if something happens in region whatever, these are the news sources that are statistically more prone to tell the actual truth of what happened.
Get rid of the LLM and like in principle, yeah, you could have things that basically try to invert whatever content algorithms that are on the sites that you use, and make your own rebalanced aggregator and so on and so on. Again, though, it depends on I think it depends on the dimension of the information, the degree to which you can actually verify things, the degree to which things are independent. And I think the danger of it is, again, it seems like even the act of trying to protect yourself from this makes you vulnerable to other kinds of weird side inferences, like the tendency to take a more extreme position just as a consequence of believing that someone might be manipulating your data.
That's it for this week's episode of the Cross Labs podcast, On My Mind. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you'll be the first to know when the next episode is out. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.